Hello class, and welcome to, I believe it's week 4 now of this very strange 10-week semester that we're doing online because of the coronavirus. Last week we talked about supply and demand, and we talked about the supply and demand curve and how they reach an equilibrium price, which becomes the price of a product on a marketplace. Today we're going to be talking about elasticities of demand and supply. Well, when you think of elasticity, what do you think of? Well, for many of you, you probably think of a rubber band. And in many ways, that's actually what we're looking at. We're trying to look at demand and supply and to see if a small change in the price of a product will lead to a very big change or small change in the quantity demanded or quantity supplied. Where basically elasticity is really the study of how steep the demand curve is or how steep the supply curve is. So with this course, we're going to be looking at elasticity of demand and also elasticity of supply. So this week this lecture we're looking at elasticity of demand, and the next lecture we'll look at elasticity of supply. We're also going to be looking at something called cross elasticity of demand and income elasticity of demand. And these are basically factors which influence the overall price elasticity of demand. So I want to give you an example here. Let's say you go down to the cafeteria at UKH when we're all back at campus and you want to buy your lunch there. What happens if you discover that the cafeteria has increased the price of food? Suddenly, rather than spending 4,000 dinar or 5,000 dinar for a meal, for the equivalent meal you're now spending 6 or 7,000 dinar. What are you going to do? Well, potentially, like most people, you might complain at first that there's been a rise in the prices, but you're probably still going to buy your lunch that day. You've got it on the tray, you've taken it to the counter, and you're going to be embarrassed if you say you're not going to buy it and it needs to be taken back. But the following day, because you're still unhappy with the new prices, you and your friends, you go to Mali Daikum and you have your lunch there instead. You are no longer demanding the cafeteria food, and now you are demanding Mali Daikum food. So this is significant. What's happening here is that when the cafeteria increased their price, the equilibrium point on the demand curve shifted up, meaning that the quantity demanded decreased. So while there is still some demand for cafeteria food, people will still be buying cafeteria food, the quantity demanded has decreased. And that's what elasticity is. It is seeing how sensitive the quantity demanded is and how that quantity changes with a change in price. If there's a big change in quantity demanded for a small change in price, we would say the demand or the price demand is elastic. If there's a change in price but the quantity demanded doesn't change a lot, we would say that the demand is inelastic. So when we talk about elasticity of demand, we can look at it in two different ways. We can look at it for a demand and supply curve for one company, such as the cafeteria food, and we will see that if the cafeteria puts up the price of its food, then lots of people will cease to buy food at the cafeteria and they're going to go to Molly Daikum to buy their lunch. Why? Because Molly Daikum has a very good substitute to the cafeteria. They're offering food, much of the same quality, and also in the same location. And so this is where if you have a close substitute, then there will be more elasticity to the demand because people have more options. If they are unhappy with the price, they are just going to go down the road to a competitor. And so generally most businesses that operate in entertainment and catering, there's high elasticity of their demand. So if they increase their prices, suddenly they could lose a very large quantity demanded of their product. So basically, when we talk about the elasticity of demand, what we're talking about is how steep the demand curve is. What is the gradient of the demand curve at the point of equilibrium between the demand and supply? If it's a very shallow curve, that will mean that there's a very large change in quantity demanded for a relatively small change in price, and we would say the demand is elastic. If the curve is really steep, that will mean that there will be a very small change in quantity demanded for a very large change in price, relatively speaking, and it could move in either direction. The price could go up or down, and that would be considered an inelastic demand. Now, we don't solely look at curves, but one of the things we've got to do is actually determine the size of the elasticity of demand by looking at the price elasticity. And this is basically trying to determine what is the gradient of that demand curve. What we're trying to do is we're trying to compare the percentage change in price with the percentage change in quantity demanded. If the percentage change in price is larger than the percentage change in quantity demanded, we would say it is inelastic. If the percentage change in quantity demanded is larger than the percentage change in price, we would say that that is elastic. So let's look at the price elasticity for demand for cafeteria food. Let's suppose that, your favorite lunch at the cafeteria, it's normally $3, but they've increased the price to $5. Well, the first thing we need to find to find the price elasticity of a demand is we need to find the percentage change in price. How do we do that? Well, there's a couple of different ways of doing it, but I'm going to teach you one method which is fairly standard. Now, this is basically where you take the new price, you minus the initial price, and then you divide it by the midpoint price. That is the price that is exactly halfway between $3 and $5. And then you multiply it by 100 to get a percentage. So in this case, the new price is $5, and we are taking away $3. That's the initial price, and then we're dividing it by $4. That $4 is the price which is exactly halfway between the new price and the old price, multiplying it by 100, and so the percentage change in price in this case is 50%. Now let's say we were moving in the other direction. Let's say that the price was initially $5, but the cafeteria has cut the price to $3. What will the percentage change in price be then? Well, we use the same formula, percentage change in price, which is new price minus initial price, over the midpoint price multiplied by 100. In this case, it'll be $3 minus $5 over $4, and so the percentage change will be negative 50%. Now, that's because it's going in the opposite direction. What you need to be aware of, though, is that we ignore the negative, because all we're trying to do here is we're trying to find the steepness of the demand curve. We don't really care at this stage whether the equilibrium point will be moving up or down on the demand curve. We want to determine just how steep it is. So that little negative sign there, we ignore. So basically, whether you increase the price or you decrease the price, the percentage change in price is the same. Now let's look at the percentage change in quantity demanded. So when the price was $5, the cafeteria sold 50 meals a day, and when the price was $3, the cafeteria sold 80 meals a day. So we do this with exactly the same formula as we did for finding the percentage change in price. To find the percentage change in quantity demanded, we take the new quantity demanded, we minus the initial quantity demanded, and we divide it by the midpoint quantity demanded before multiplying it by 100 in order to find the percentage. So in this case, what we're looking at is the case of where the first case where the cafeteria raised their prices. So the initial quantity demanded when the price was $3 was 80 meals a day. And now with the new price at $5, only 50 meals a day are sold. And the midpoint between those two quantity demanded values is 65. So that gives us a percentage change in quantity demanded, which is 46%. This is a very easy calculation, I would hope you are finding, but you do need to remember to bring your calculators into the exams, and also you'll need it for some assignment questions, but it's not high-end maths. So, what is the percentage change in price and what is the percentage change in quantity? Well, you don't need to be a genius to realize that here the percentage change in price is greater than the percentage change in quantity. 50% is greater than 46%. So we would say that the price elasticity, which remember that is the percentage change in quantity demanded over the price elasticity of demand is the percentage change in quantity demanded over the percentage change in price. That is 46 over 50. That means that the price elasticity of demand is 0.92. Now that is less than 1. That means that the demand curve relative to the equilibrium price is basically steeper than 45 degrees. This is where we would describe the demand for food at the cafeteria, for this meal at least. It is relatively inelastic because the price of elasticity of demand is less than 1. So just remember, just as a little recap, that we ignore the negative sign if there's a price cut when we're determining the change if we're trying to determine the percentage change in price and there's a price cut, that's going to give us a negative value, and same with the quantity demanded, but we ignore these negative values. We're only ever taking the absolute values. But remember the demand curve, it's high the price is high and the quantity demanded is low, and then as the price decreases, the quantity demanded increases along the demand curve. That's the direction the demand curve goes in. Now, naturally, that gradient is actually a negative if we're talking in maths, but we ignore the negative. And so even though the price and the quantity demanded always act in negative directions, we ignore the minus sign. And so we're just using the absolute values, and if the percentage change in price is greater than the percentage change in the quantity demanded, we would say it is inelastic, and if it is lesser, we would say it is elastic. So let's remember this. If the demand is elastic, the percentage change in the quantity demanded exceeds the percentage change in price. So that means that the price elasticity of demand will be greater than 1. And we would say the demand is elastic. It's more sensitive to a change in price. Now, if the percentage change in quantity demanded is exactly the same as the percentage change in price, then the demand curve, if the x and y axes are using percentage units, it's on a 45-degree angle, and we would call this unit elastic. It's neutral. It's neither elastic nor inelastic. Now, if the demand is inelastic, that's where the percentage change in quantity demanded is less than the price change as a percentage. So if you were a seller, you could sell your product for a higher price, and it's not actually going to affect the quantity demanded that much. Now, in this case, the price elasticity of demand, the percentage change in quantity demanded over the percentage change in price, will be less than 0, and we would consider the demand inelastic. Now, there's a couple of other definitions here. If the demand curve is perfectly flat, that means if there is if the demand curve, if there is a next to 0 percentage change in price, there will be a completely infinite change in percentage of quantity demanded. And so in this case, the price elasticity of demand is finite. It's a huge number. Now, in this case, where would we have a case like this? Well, it's not for whole markets. Usually it's for sellers who are oh, pardon me, don't worry, it's not coronavirus, just allergies. Normally, if you are a seller of a commodity, something such as spring water, you're selling bottled water, but there are a multitude of other sellers in the market, and so the market price is set by other sellers as well. Now, the demand for your product is fixed on the market price. So if 600 ml bottles of water or 350 ml bottles of water were sold at 250 dinar, and you decided, well, for my bottle, Avan's magic water, let's say, I'm going to start selling it for 500 dinar, you will find no one will buy your product because they will just get a different water out of the fridge. The demand for your specific product is perfectly elastic, and so you cannot change the price. Now, a demand would be considered perfectly inelastic when the demand curve is perfectly vertical. And again, this would mean that basically the price elasticity of demand would be 0, or very close to zero, because basically you have a finite no change in quantity demanded. 0 divided by any other number will equal 0. And so what happens here is what? We basically get a perfectly straight line, vertical for the demand curve. It is the demand has very little sensitivity. The quantity demanded, sorry, has very little sensitivity to change with a change in price. So an example of this would be a product where it is a necessity, people have to buy it, and there's no other alternative, there's no substitute. So an example of this could be medicine, for example. If you need a medicine to survive, you've got a rare disease and you need to keep buying this pill that you've got to take every day in order to live. If they are selling that at $20 a pill, it's kind of annoying, but you're going to be buying that pill, one for every day. Now, suddenly, if they decide to up the price to $25 per pill, is that going to affect your quantity demanded? No. You're still going to buy it at exactly the same quantity demanded. You're not going to buy less because you need one pill a day, and you're definitely not going to buy more pills than you need to. And so that would be an example of perfectly inelastic demand. Let's have a look at some of these examples on graphs. So this is an example of a perfectly elastic demand, and here we have what is a demand curve for spring water. We've got the example of a van selling spring water, and let's say that for every gallon of water the price is $1. Now you can see the quantity demanded there varies, but it's always on that one price. If you suddenly moved your price up, you will sell 0 bottles. So if there is a close to 0% change in price, that will lead to a huge change in the percentage change in quantity demanded. So this is perfectly elastic. This means that the price elasticity of demand is a very large number, or finite if it's completely perfectly elastic. So that's perfectly elastic demand. This is usually for when you're doing a demand curve for a single seller or single business in a larger market where all of the substitute products from other businesses are identical. So something like a commodity like spring water. Let's now look at what would be considered elastic demand. So we're looking at PlayStations here. We have the demand curve for PlayStations in Erbil. And what we have is on the y-axis we've got the price of PlayStations in dollars, and on the x-axis the quantity demanded, the number of PlayStations that are sold every month in Erbil. And you can see currently the price of a PlayStation is $95, and 110 PlayStations are sold every month. So what would happen if PlayStation increased the price of their PlayStation to by 10%? It goes from $95 to $105. So 105 minus 95 is 10, divided by the midpoint, which is 100. So the percentage price change will be 10%. The quantity demanded in that case is going to drop by 20%. It drops from being 110 to 90. This means that you basically have 20 over the midpoint of 100. You're going to have a 20% change in quantity demanded. So what will the price elasticity of demand be? Well, it's going to be 20 over 10. It's going to be 2. Because the number is greater than 1, we would say that this is elastic, which means that generally the curve, if everything is even and the x and y axes have the same units, the curve curves at a shallower angle than 45 degrees. Now let's have a look at something which is unit elastic. Let's say that you're selling a trip. Let's say you work in the transportation industry. Maybe you're a taxi driver, and basically you're a long distance taxi driver, and you can give people lifts from Erbil to Basra. You've got a taxi business which is taking people from Basra and Baghdad to Erbil and vice versa. Now, let's say that initially the price for the trip is $95. And the quantity demanded, number of trips that people take every month, is 105. You increase the price to $105. That's a 10% price rise. And the quantity demanded will drop to 95 trips per month. So that's a 10% decrease in the quantity demanded. What is the price elasticity of demand? Well, it is 10% over 10%. It equals 1. That means that line there between the black dot and the red dot is perfectly 45 degrees if the units are the same for the x and y axes. And so this is neither elastic nor perfectly elastic. Now, one of the things you need to know is, what will your revenue be? What will be the money you make? Well, it will be exactly the same. 95 times $105 is the same as $95 times 105. Those little dotted lines there, which make little rectangles, you've got a red rectangle there, and you also have a black rectangle. They have exactly the same area. So this means that your profit, your revenue at least, does not change. And we'll talk more about that later in the next lecture. So let's now look at something that has a fairly inelastic demand. So let's say that this is often the case for things where there's people will continue to buy it regardless of the price. And so this is often the case for something where people just have a habit of taking it, and it's a very small portion of their income. So an example could be chewing gum. What do I pay for chewing gum? Well, I usually buy a big packet of 250 dinar. But if they change the price to 300 dinar, it's probably not going to change my habit. I'm still going to demand the same quantity. So let's look here. We've got the demand curve for chewing gum, and you can see that the initial price is 90 cents per packet, and the quantity demanded is 105 packets per month. We're looking at a whole market, not just one person here. So what happens if they raise the price to 110 cents per packet? That's a 20% rise in the price. The quantity demanded of gum, that's going to decrease to 95 packets per month, and so that will be a 10% decrease. Well, the price of elasticity of demand that's going to be 10% over 20%, which will mean that it is 0.5. It is less than 1. So we would say that the demand for gum is inelastic. That curve there is considered steep. It is steeper if this was a ski slope, it would be a black run. It would be a slope that only the expert skiers would ski down. And what if it was perfectly inelastic? Well, this is where this, again, I don't really know where this really exists in the real world, but medicine is a very good example of this, because if they change the price of a medicine that you need to live, you're probably still going to demand the medicine at the same quantity. So let's say that your medicine, that this medicine that they're selling, the price is currently 95 cents per dose. And there's 100 people who need this medicine every day, and so the quantity demanded is 100 per day. Now, what happens if they increase the price of the dose to 105 cents per dose? Well, that's going to be a percentage rise of in this case 10%. But what happens to the quantity demanded? It doesn't change at all. It stays at 100. So regardless of what the price is, if there's no other substitute and you can't go to another medicine, well, the seller can basically sell for whatever he wants, while being ethical, and people will keep demanding the same quantity demanded. In this case, the price elasticity of demand is close to 0. You have 0 divided by any other number will equal 0. So the demand for medicine in this case is perfectly inelastic. So what are some of the things which influence the price elasticity of demand? Because the elasticity of demand, the steepness of the demand curve, that's different for different products. So there's usually two categories that we talk about that influence the price elasticity of demand. The first is the availability of substitutes, and the other thing is proportion of income spent. So with the example of availability of substitutes, if there's a lot of other substitutes that people can easily go to quickly, then we would say that there is high elasticity. That means that for things like spring water, if Life spring water suddenly upped their prices, everyone would stop buying Life spring water and they would just get the other spring water that was available in the fridge when they go to the Dukan. But if there's no other substitute, something like medicine, if you need insulin for your diabetes, then you're going to have very low elasticity, or the demand is going to be inelastic. It's going to be a very steep demand curve, or maybe even perfectly inelastic in the case of medicine, because there's no other substitute. The other thing which influences price elasticity of demand is proportion of income spent. So I gave you an example of chewing gum. Now, some chewing gum, that is a very small portion of my salary. One packet of chewing gum is, I don't know, I think it's 250 dinar. It's so small I don't actually even pay any attention to the price. Now, that's a very small portion of your salary, even for someone like me, and I have a very small salary. Now, if they suddenly increased the price by 100% to 500 dinar per packet, that's probably not going to influence the quantity that I demand because it's such a small portion of my salary. But if it's a very large portion of my salary, something like a car, if Toyota Yaris's suddenly went up in price by $5,000, then the quantity demanded of Toyota Yaris's is going to drop significantly. If there's a higher proportion of the income spent on the product, then that's going to increase the elasticity of demand for that product. So with the availability of substitutes, remember, if there's a substitute which is easy to find, the good will be very elastic. If it's hard to find, the good will be inelastic. So an example where there's an easy substitute would be something like Coca-Cola. If Coke just put up their prices, you're just going to buy Pepsi. It's basically the same thing, and it's just as available. But if it's something like medicine, if there's no other medicine for your disease, you're going to keep buying it at the same quantity regardless of the price. It will be relatively inelastic. Now, there are three things that influence how easy it is to find a substitute for a good. So remember what I said before, that there were two main factors that influence the price of elasticity of demand. Now, one of those factors I'm now breaking into three sub-factors. It's kind of like the movie Inception. So one of the things is if it is a luxury versus necessity. If it's a necessity, that means there's not really any other substitute for it. So the demand for that necessity is going to be relatively inelastic. So food, for example, is a necessity. So if we were going to do a supply-demand curve for food generally, you're going to find that the demand curve for food is inelastic. People are still going to eat the same amount of food regardless of what the price is. But if we were looking at just a small company that was offering food, such as the university cafeteria, there will be some elasticity to their demand curve. Because if they change their prices, people will stop buying as much food at the cafeteria if they increase the price, and they'll just go and buy their lunch at Mully Daikum. Now, if it's a luxury item that has many substitutes, so something like a boat, there could be a very elastic demand for that boat. Why? Because if the boat that I want changes its price, I will just say, you know what, I'm going to look at buying a different kind of boat. Or holidays are another one. You can have supply and demand curves for holidays. If you were really thinking about this summer having a summer holiday in Germany, and you were thinking this is going to be a great holiday for the family, and you think it's going to cost the family maybe $5,000 to go to Germany, and then the price of Germany goes up, and suddenly the tickets and the hotels, they become more expensive, and it's about $6,000. You can easily go to a substitute. You could go to a holiday in Georgia, for example. And so for a luxury good, there's usually lots of other substitutes, and so demand is more elastic. And the other thing that influences the elasticity is the narrowness of definition. Now, this can be a little bit hard to explain, so I'm going to try and do this slowly. But if we were going to say what is the demand for something which is fairly necessary, something like rice, generally, we would say that there's a reasonably inelastic demand because there isn't really a substitute for rice. I mean, I guess you could eat corn or potatoes, but most of the world, they prefer eating rice. But what if we were going to narrow the definition to basmati rice? Suddenly, there's more substitutes for basmati rice than rice generally because they can actually, you can buy different kinds of rice, can't you, other than basmati. You could buy aromatic rice, you can buy couscous rice, you can buy Moroccan rice, or that really fancy Iranian rice, which I forget the name of. And so because there's now more substitutes, because you've narrowed the definition, the the elasticity of demand for basmati rice will be more than the elasticity of demand for rice generally. What if you were going to narrow the definition even more? What if you were going to look at a particular company of rice? So the brand of rice that I buy and my wife buys is something called Mahmoud basmati rice. So from the company Mahmoud Rice. So what would happen if they changed their price, if they increased their price? Well, very quickly, Sarah and I, we would stop buying Mahmoud rice and we would buy a different brand of basmati rice because there's plenty of substitutes available and we just have to get a different brand of rice off the shelf. So that would be much more elastic than basmati rice generally. And basmati rice generally would be more elastic than rice generally, and rice would be more elastic than food generally. And so as you narrow the definition and you have a more specific supply and demand curve for a more specific product, the elasticity of demand will increase. So if it's narrowly defined, the good is elastic. If it's broadly defined, the good is inelastic. If you're not clear on that, let's look at the next slides. Sorry, what I mean is if you're not clear on how the narrowness of definition affects the elasticity of demand, ask me in the tutorial. So just as a recap, there are two things which influence the elasticity of demand: the availability of substitutes and the effect of income or proportion of income spent on the product. And the availability of substitutes is affected by three things. The first one is whether the product is a necessity or it's a luxury good. And secondly, if it's how narrow the definition is, if it's just rice or Mahmoud basmati rice. And the third one now is the time elapsed since the price change. Now this one may be a little bit hard to see initially too, but let's consider the example of gasoline, so petrol, benzene. Let's say that normally I'm filling up my car with fuel and it costs $30. Now, let's say that I go and fill up my car at the end of the work week and the guy says, the price has gone up, it's now $45. What's going to happen? Well, I might be a bit grumpy, but I'm still going to buy the fuel. I'm still going to buy the same amount of quantity of fuel as I normally did. So in the short term, the demand for benzene, the demand for petrol is inelastic. But next week, people are going to stop driving their cars as much. And over the next few months, people might consider buying smaller cars that use less fuel. And over the next few years, people might consider using more public transport or buying hybrid cars. And so in the long term, the quantity demanded for the product, fuel in this case, decreases because of the price change. And so you see that initially in the short term, the demand, the price elasticity of demand was inelastic, but in the long term it became elastic. So we can talk about that in the tutorial if you want, and I can show that to you on graphs. Now let's talk now about the proportion of income spent and how that influences the price elasticity of demand. As I said before, if a price rise of a product happens, and it's a very large portion of the person's income, then there's going to be far fewer people who are going to be willing to buy that product. So if there's a price rise, similar to what we talked about before, if there's a decrease in incomes generally, if it's a luxury good, people cannot afford to buy the same quantity. If it's a necessity, it's going to be more inelastic. But if it's a greater proportion of their income, then it's going to be more elastic in that demand for the good. So an example of chewing gum, for example, if that increases the price from 250 dinar to 500 dinar, that's a 100% change in price, in percentage. Now, what's that going to do to the quantity demanded for chewing gum in Erbil? Probably not a lot. There might be a few people who buy chewing gum a little bit less, but the quantity demanded is going to have a very small change. So the price elasticity of demand is going to be less than zero. It's still going to be considerably elastic. But what would happen if you were going to take a product that was a much larger portion of people's incomes? Let's consider the Toyota Land Cruiser, for example. Now, I believe a Toyota Land Cruiser sells for about 70,000 US dollars. Let's say that has the same percentage price rise. It rises by 100%, so it goes to being about $140,000. I'm not using the midpoint method here, but you get my point. Suddenly, that's going to, how many people are going to buy the Toyota Land Cruiser? Well, previously with the initial price, I think there was probably maybe 10 Toyota Land Cruisers being sold every week in Erbil. If it goes up to being $140,000, very few people can afford a $140,000 car. They might sell maybe one Toyota Land Cruiser every month, in the best case scenario, probably one every year. And so there's going to be a big change in the quantity demanded with in comparison to the percentage change in price demanded. A percentage change in price. So the price elasticity of demand is going to be above zero. It's going to be relatively inelastic. And that's because the product is a much larger proportion of the market's incomes. So remember, how do we compute the price of elasticity? It's the percentage change in quantity demanded over the percentage change in price. And remember, we ignore minus signs, we ignore negative values. So if it is 1 and the percentage change in price is the same as the percentage change in quantity demanded, that's going to be unit elastic. But if it is greater than 1, we would say demand is elastic. And if it is less than 1, we would say that the demand is inelastic. So let's have a calculation here. Let's say that we are buying alcohol. We're at a bar. I think this is probably something Hummer would do more than anyone else in the class. Let's say that Hummer quits civil engineering and he opens up a nightclub in Ainkawa, and he's selling bottles of vodka or cups of vodka to probably Shana and Ivan. I think they look like alcoholics. Now, let's say that the price of cups of vodka every night are $3 currently, $3 per cup. And he is selling 15 cups of vodka every hour. Boy, that's a lot of alcohol he's selling. I don't know why he would continue being a civil engineer. That's good money there he's making. Now, what's going to happen if he increases the price to $5? Well, suddenly the quantity demanded drops to 5. So the percentage change in price, remember the midpoint is $4, that's going to be a percentage change in price of 50%. Now, the percentage change in quantity demanded is going to go from being 15 cups to 5 cups, so that, and the midpoint is 10. So 15 minus 5 is 10 over the midpoint of 10. That means the percentage change in quantity demanded is 100%. So what's the price elasticity of demand going to be? Well, it's going to be 100% over 50%. It's going to be the percentage change of quantity over the percentage change in price. So the price elasticity is going to be 2. That curve represents a value of 2, the gradient. That means that there is the price is relatively elastic. It is higher than 1. So remember, percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in price. Now, we can use this formula to calculate the price elasticity of demand for a Starbucks latte. Okay, sorry, that example before was for Starbucks lattes, not for cups of vodka. I'm clearly a very depraved man. I'm thinking about alcoholism. You would too if you were a lecturer. Now, let's interpret the price elasticity of demand number. If it's over 2, then that means it's elastic. The demand for cups of coffee is elastic. And that's because there's other substitutes. You don't have to buy your coffee from Starbucks, and you don't have to buy your vodka from Hummer. You could go to a different nightclub or a different coffee shop, respectfully. And also, it's a very small portion of a buyer's income. So even if a cup of coffee is $3, that's a very small portion of my income, even if you're a poor, depraved lecturer from University of Kurdistan. And so what this means, and we'll get to this later too, but if the coffee shop raised its prices, then that would mean that their overall revenue, that's the money you get into your till, will decrease in total. Even though you make more revenue per cup, you will lose more business. You will lose more clients. And so what you could find is actually, if you lower your price, you will actually get considerably more customers, and you will have more revenue, more money. You will be making more money. And so this is where the business acumen comes in, to recognizing how elastic your demand is. So remember that with a typical demand curve, there is a curve to it. It starts off steep, but it becomes shallower. Now, the slope is basically referring to the responsiveness of demand to a change in price. And so it's not exactly the same as elasticity, because elasticity, you are basically measuring the gradient of the line at a particular point. You're basically looking at the tangent line of the equilibrium to the demand curve. And so as the price goes up or decreases, the elasticity will vary. And so usually the equilibrium, and we'll talk more about this later in the next lecture, but normally the equilibrium where you have the fixed market price, where the supply curve and the demand curve interact, normally that is going to be unit elastic at that point for whole markets for a given product. And so it will be more elastic the lower below that midpoint, and it will be higher, it will have more inelasticity above that point. I'll talk more about that later in the next slide, in the next lecture. If you don't understand that, don't worry too much. So I now want to talk to you about the total revenue. So revenue, look this word up in a dictionary if you don't understand it, but it's basically the money that you are receiving from a seller. So if I sell you a packet of tissues, Kleenex, and I sell it to you for 250 dinar, the revenue I get is 250 dinar. But what you don't know is that there was an expense to that Kleenex too. I actually had to buy it for 50 dinar. That was my expense. The profit I made is the revenue minus the expense. That's going to be 200 dinar in this instant. So how do we work out the total revenue, and what is the interaction with the price elasticity of demand? Well, we need to realize that the total revenue is the price of a good multiplied by the quantity sold of a good. And so the total revenue test is basically a way of estimating the price elasticity of demand by observing changes in your total revenue when you change the price of your good. And so if the demand is elastic, if you raise the price just slightly, there is going to be a large decrease in the quantity demanded, and your total revenue will decrease. And so in this case, if the price is elastic, you actually want to be looking to lower the price of your good so that you can increase your revenue. But if the demand is inelastic, that means that if you raise the price ever so slightly, there's going to be an even smaller percentage decrease in the quantity demanded. So if you raise your price, that's not going to affect the number of customers that are buying your product significantly, and so your total revenue increases. And this can be seen graphically. So if the price and the total revenue change is in the opposite direction, that means the demand is elastic. If you increase the price and your total revenue decreases, that's because you have an elastic demand for your product. But if it remains unchanged, you have unit elasticity. And if they go in the same direction, if you increase the price and your total revenue increases, then demand is inelastic. I'll try and show that to you graphically right now. So here we have a coffee shop, a Starbucks coffee shop, and you can see that they are selling cups of coffee, and there's the quantity of cups they're selling per hour, and you've got the demand curve on the right. So let's say that currently you're selling the cups of coffee at $3 a cup, and the quantity demanded is 15 cups an hour. The total revenue, the amount of money you're making every hour, is 15 times 3, that's $45. So $45 an hour. Now, if you were to raise the price by $5 a cup, suddenly the quantity demanded drops to 5. Well, what's going to happen then? Well, suddenly the total revenue is going to be 5 times 5, it's going to be $25 an hour. So you've had a decrease in the total revenue. So what does that mean? You increase the price and you decrease the amount of money you're making? Well, that's because the demand is elastic. There is plenty of other substitutes. People can easily just stop buying coffees from your coffee shop and go to another coffee shop. Demand is elastic. Now let's look at an inelastic demand. An example could be books. If you have required reading for a module, then you have to buy the book regardless of how much it costs. Let's say that you have a book that is currently being sold at $50 and the quantity demanded is 5 million of these books are being sold every year. Clearly this is not a textbook for civil engineering. This is a specialist. This is not a specialist book. It's something like Harry Potter, which sells in ubiquity. So if J.K. Rowling is selling her Harry Potter book currently at $50 a book, and she's selling 5 million books a year, her total revenue is 250 million a year. And sure enough, J.K. Rowling is incredibly rich. Now, what would happen if she increased the price to $75 a book? Well, the quantity demanded only drops slightly to 4 million books a year. Suddenly, 75 times 4 means she is now making 300 million books a year. And so the total revenue increases with an increase in price. So the demand is inelastic. Now, you would think that J.K. Rowling, she wants to make as much money as possible. So if she has an inelastic demand for her books, she's going to increase the price. Well, probably, but not necessarily, because keep in mind that keep in mind that potentially she has expenses to meet. That if she is only producing a smaller number of books, there will be certain economies of scale that she has to meet, but she's probably going to increase her price to increase her revenue, because an increase in revenue will probably mean she makes more profit as well. So, what are some of the applications of price elasticity of demand? Well, let's look at the price of oranges, for example. Let's say that the elasticity of demand for agricultural products such as oranges is 0.4. That means there's a relatively inelastic demand for oranges. Now let's say that if there is a frost, meaning that farmers cannot grow as many oranges as they normally do, they have a poor season, that means that, and assuming that the demand doesn't change, then the supply is going to be cut. The supply curve is going to move to the left, and that will mean that there's only a 1% decrease in the quantity harvested and the quantity demanded, of course, because it's where the demand and supply curve interact. But that will lead to a 2.5% increase in price. The increase in price is greater than the change in quantity supplied and demanded. And so 1 over 2.5 equals about 0.4. And demand is relatively inelastic. And so farmers, their total revenue will increase. That means if you are a farmer who can actually grow oranges, and other farmers weren't able to grow oranges because of the frost, your revenue is going to increase. You're going to do very well. Now let's look at an example here of something that is addictive. Let's look at something like shisha. Now shisha is tobacco. It's got nicotine in it, so it's very addictive. What do you think the demand for shisha is? Is it elastic or is it inelastic? If you are watching this on YouTube, you might want to just pause the video now and just think about this for 30 seconds or so. Well, you should be able to determine here that the demand for shisha is inelastic because people get addicted to shisha. They cannot change their habits. Once they have a habit of smoking shisha every day or every week, or cigarettes, for example, is another one. If you increase the price of cigarettes in a market, people are still going to demand the same quantity. There might be some people who can stop taking it, but most people are still going to be buying shisha. And so the quantity demanded changes very little compared to a relatively large percentage change in price. It is going to be an inelastic demand. The demand curve is going to be very steep. So remember, there's an influence of addiction and elasticity. If a product is addictive, then potentially it's going to have less elasticity. So what if you're a non-user and you're not addicted to the substance? Well, I don't smoke shisha, I'm not addicted to it, but occasionally I will buy one. I probably smoke maybe one shisha a year. I'm an extremely part-time user of shisha, mostly because I'm scared of becoming addicted. Well, what would happen if the price of shisha went up from 10,000 dinar for shisha to 25,000 dinar for shisha? I'm probably going to stop buying shisha entirely. So for non-users, you can see that the demand is very elastic because normally things which are addictive are also very luxurious. They're luxury items rather than necessities. But what happens for someone who's already addicted? If it's one of the boys from the UG2 class, they're all smokers. They smoke way too much. It's a disgusting habit. Well, if they have an increase in price of their shisha, they're probably not going to be able to stop, or they're going to find it they have a real lack of willingness to stop the amount of shisha that they are currently demanding. And so for them, the demand for shisha is inelastic. So here's another example here. Let's say that I decide I'm not making enough money as a lecturer at the University of Kurdistan, and so I decide I'm going to start selling cocaine to UKH students just for some supplementary income. Now, initially, I start giving you cocaine for free. I start giving it to you as a free gift on the first week of uni. Now, gradually, I start increasing my prices. Why do I do that? Well, initially, if I came to you and I said, do you want to buy some cocaine off me? It's only $100. you're going to say, get real, I'm not interested. But if I say, do you want to buy some cocaine off me? And it's if I say, do you want some cocaine? It's just a free gift. Potentially, there's going to be a few students at the university who are curious and they think, well, why not? And then I give them free cocaine for a few weeks. But then I start saying, okay, you've got to start buying it now. And I start selling it for $10. And then a few weeks later, $20, $30. What am I doing? I'm getting them addicted to it. And as they're addicted to the cocaine, they lose the ability to say no. And so as I increase the price, they lose the ability to decrease their quantity that they're demanding. And so that's, if you ever want to become a drug lord, that's what you do. You initially try to get people addicted. You try to give the drugs away as a free gift, even though those drugs cost you money. You're trying to build a market of people who cannot say no to the drugs. Because as people get more addicted, that means the demand for your product becomes more inelastic. And that means you can slowly increase your price and they will not stop snorting cocaine. And you will make more revenue and more profit and become very wealthy, just like Heisenberg. Another example is Red Bull. So I don't know if you ever drink Red Bull, but it's quite an expensive drink. I think for one can of Red Bull, it's around 4,000 dinar for one can, I think. Now, when Red Bull first came on the marketplace, I remember this. It was when I was at university. It was around 2006 to 2009. It was completely free. And what they used to do was they used to go to sports events and music festivals, and they would get these really attractive promotional girls for marketing to just come up to men and hand you Red Bulls for free. And so I remember I drank a lot of Red Bull when I was at university, and I never ever bought a Red Bull. And people were thinking, this is so weird. Why is this company giving away their product? Why would anyone ever buy Red Bull? Well, eventually, people got a taste for Red Bull, and Red Bull is very addictive. It's got a lot of caffeine in it and a lot of sugar. And so, even though the company was losing a lot of money in the first few years, this was all part of their marketing strategy. They spent a fortune on marketing, just handing out free promos, and they got people addicted. And so now they don't have the same promo girls, they don't market to the same extent, and people are buying Red Bulls from the shop at a very high price because they're addicted, and demand is relatively inelastic now. So there are a few other applications to price elasticity, but one of the things is that when people are addicted to a bad substance, one of the ways governments often try to influence people to buy less of a product is to make it really highly taxed. So, for example, cigarettes and alcohol are bad for you. And so one of the ways governments will sometimes try to stop people smoking so much and drinking so much alcohol is they will put a high tax on it. And this is called a Pareto tax. You're going to learn more about that later. Now, for example, in New Zealand, if I wanted to buy it, hardly anyone smokes, but if I wanted to buy a packet of cigarettes in New Zealand, it would cost me about $20. They're very expensive. Now, you've got to realize that the company, the cigarette company, they are only selling the cigarettes from. They're probably only making about $1 in revenue or profit from every packet of cigarettes. but there's $19, which is tax, which goes to the government. And the government does this to raise revenue for the government, but also to try and discourage people from buying cigarettes because they're bad for you. But the issue is, if there's if it's an addictive substance and there's an inelastic demand for the product because people are addicted to it, having a very high tax will only have, and raising the price of cigarettes or alcohol, it only has a very modest effect on those who are already, on the quantity demanded from those who are already having cigarettes, who are already addicted to it. What it does do, though, is it stops people who are not habitual users but may become smokers and drinkers from buying it. So having a high tax on cigarettes is a way to stop young people who aren't addicted to cigarettes taking up the habit. And that's why in New Zealand, where they've had a high tax on cigarettes, most people who smoke are fairly old people. They're people 50 years or older. The number of young people who smoke, it's a very small number because of the tax, and they grew up with the high tax on cigarettes, so they never got into the habit and addiction of cigarettes. Let's do one final calculation here. I want you to work out what is the elasticity for hotel beds in Erbil. So let's say that on average, currently, the price of a hotel room is $70 per night, and in Erbil, 5,000 people sleep in hotel rooms every night. Now, let's say that that price increased to $90 a night on average, and the new quantity demanded is 3,000. I want you to work out, are hotel rooms, are they elastic or inelastic in their demand? Well, how do we go about doing that? We need to first work out the percentage change in quantity demanded. That's 5,000 minus 3,000, or 2,000, over 4,000. 4,000 being the midpoint between 5,000 and 3,000, so that's 50%. And the percentage change in price, that's going to be $90 minus 70 over 80, 80 being the midpoint between 90 and 70, 25%. Now, you may see that I've put the 70 and the 90, I've switched them round. It doesn't actually matter, because remember, we're taking the absolute value. It doesn't matter. We're trying to ignore if it's a negative value. And so the price of elasticity of demand will depend on those two factors. 50%, the percentage change in quantity demanded, over 25% percentage change in price equals 2. Therefore, because it's higher than 1, we know that the price elasticity of demand is elastic. You should be able to do that very simple calculation, as well as do a total revenue test. Now, that's the end of this lecture for today. If you've got any questions about this material, please let me know. Thank you and goodbye.